Welcome to another episode of the Gay Barchive Show, where we explore gay history one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and today we'll be chatting with Gwendolyn Stegall, a junior architect and former research consultant for the New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project. So, welcome to the show, Gwendolyn.
Thank you for having me.
I understand that you have a kind of unique background, being an architect in the field of architecture, and yet your master's thesis was based on the history of lesbian gathering spaces in New York City. That seems like a little bit of an unusual blend. It's not something I would expect the average person with their eyes set on architecture to be doing as a master's thesis.
Just to clarify, the master's thesis was for my historic preservation degree. So
Okay.
I had two degrees, architecture and historic preservation. So this was part of the preservation work, but even for preservation, it's an unusual topic. I will say that preservation as a field is broadening its scope. It started as, preserve Penn Station, preserve the beautiful buildings that are in danger of disappearing. And there's still a lot of that, and still a lot of, houses of founding fathers and things like that. But the story is starting to expand, as in many fields. We are starting to tell deeper stories and more stories. So, if you have a historic house museum, for example, the story of its gay occupant maybe was never told, and now it's starting to be told. Or if you have a house of a slave owner, the stories of the slaves are starting to be told, things like that. So the field is expanding, and I see my work as part of the expansion of this field. And I'm very lucky to have many wonderful allies in this work in New York. And certainly it's a place where the idea of historic preservation as a field is growing quickly. So
Now,
not so out of the the mainstream.
were you surprised when you started delving into the topic that you were going to find record of lesbian gathering spaces in New York City that reached back over 100 years?
And also, just to clarify, I studied lesbian bars. So I limited my scope to what I considered a bar for lesbians, which was, my definition was a space that the majority of the time served mostly women who identified either as lesbian or loving other women. Obviously, these terms change throughout the decades. So to clarify, the spaces that I found that are sort of further back before the 1930s, I've labeled as proto-lesbian bars. So I see them as spaces that allowed for lesbian bars to come into existence. But the first lesbian bar, the way I've defined it, seems to come a little bit later in the 20th century, around 30s, 40s. The very first one I could find was in San Francisco, and I believe the late 20s, but in New York, at any rate, the first one is from the 30s. So yes, it is almost 100 years of lesbian bars, but my history goes back a little bit further to understand how those spaces could even exist to begin with. And that was about the timeline I expected for this history. I actually expected to find even less material than I did for that far back, because I knew that this was a purposefully hidden history that has been suppressed for the majority of the 20th century. So the materials that I did find were very exciting, and I definitely want to delve further into that early part of the century because there's the least amount of information available, but I was able to find enough to put a few sites together, and I'm sure there's more out there that I haven't explored yet.
I'm quite sure. When I started my project researching lost gay bars from around the country is what I was focusing on, the US. When I reached the first 100 and then the first 200, I thought, oh, wow, this is, I'm really making progress here. A year later, I was at 1,300 plus, and I'm still finding that there are many, many, many more. A couple of historians in Chicago recently sent me a list of all the known or alleged gay spaces in the history of Chicago, and their list includes over 700 establishments.
Wow.
So you can imagine how many there must have been in New York or, other cities.
Yeah.
Now, when I started looking into New York, one of the oldest ones I found, and I'm sure you've seen information about this too, was a place called Pfaff's, Pfaff. Mm-hmm. And it was a restaurant on the main street level. And then underground, they had like a beer cellar that was known for attracting a bohemian, artistic, homosexual clientele, and many famous people who have since been outed. Like I believe Walt Whitman was a regular there. So I'm sure the same is true of the women's scene in New York. The one that you've mentioned in your documentary video, The Past and Future of New York City's Lesbian Bars, that immediately struck a chord with me was Mad Hatter. Mm-hmm. I've been hearing about that for as long as practically since I started this project, and it keeps coming up over and over again. So it's, but that's one of the places you're talking about was kind of a predecessor to an official lesbian bar. It was accepting of and welcoming to single women, unaccompanied women, lesbians, or people who did not identify as part of the mainstream community. So,
yes. And what was notable to me about that bar is it was owned and operated, at least for a time of its existence, by a woman who was very open about her partnership with another woman. So not only was it for a bohemian, emerging gay crowd, but it was owned by someone who was very open about her own sexuality. So it's part of why it made my list of important early spaces.
Now, my favorite memory about the Mad Hatter from the research I've done is the fact that the writing there, it did not say Mad Hatter outside the building. It said down the rabbit hole.
Yes.
Obviously a reference to Lewis Carroll, but my understanding, and it was backwards. It was mirror image text. It wasn't. But I also understand that the inside of the bar was full of quotes about madness. That there were different sayings or quotes painted on the walls that had to do with madness and such. Which,
and there's also images from the original illustrations of Alice in Wonderland. So that's one of the images I have in my thesis. I'm not sure if it made it into the video that you watched, but
I don't remember.
Really
I'm sure I can find it though.
I can send it to you. I think, it's from the Museum of the City of New York. So I'm not sure about the rights of sharing it, but it's a great image anyway.
Also, another thing that was kind of interesting about, you were talking about Jimmy, the woman who was the owner of the bar and was open about her female partner. But in keeping with the times, at least for a brief time, she was also married to a man.
Yes.
And that man was Hendrik Willem van Loon, who owned the village bookshop across the street. Um, and his bookshop was known for having the door to the bookshop signed by famous people who came to that location. But he was a regular across the street at the Mad Hatter. So that was, kind of interesting. That was, I think, his second of 3 or 4 wives. Um, so obviously, neither one of them were very committed to the relationship.
Yeah.
So in the 20s, in the from 1910 to 1920, you had several of these kind of tea rooms that were frequented by women that we would now probably identify as lesbians in New York City. One of them was called Polly's, and the other one was Eve Adams Tea Room. Is that correct? Do you have any idea out of those, those 3, which one might have been the most popular, or had the biggest impact on the community there, or were they all just kind of their own little thing in their own little pocket of the world?
I think they had sort of different impacts, which is why I pulled them out as examples. Polly's wasn't necessarily identified as a, space for the LGBTQ community. However, they identified themselves at that point. It was mainly important to this history for the meetings of the Heterodoxy Club, which was a group of early thinkers, all women from all different backgrounds, many of whom happened to be out about their own sexuality and, lesbianism, as we would call it today. So, women from that group came to that place, but it wasn't necessarily because of the place, it was because of the group. I mean, it was because of the neighborhood, and, these are all in Greenwich Village and in this, bohemian time, which of course then continues to be a center for LGBTQ life through today. But I think maybe the other 2 were a little bit more explicit about their, gay clientele or their gayness, if you want to put it that way. And I think some of my information might not be completely accurate about Eve Adams Tea Room. There's a gentleman coming out with a book specifically about Eve Adams, and I am very interested to read it because he's done much more in-depth research than I've done in my small entry. But at least according to legend, there was a sign in the window of Eve Adams Tea Room that said, "Men are admitted but not welcome." And we definitely know that her books that had very explicit lesbian content were banned, and that's part of the reason why the space was shut down. So in many ways, that was the most explicitly, lesbian space, but it was also the shortest in duration. So I'm not sure if you can say it has the most impact. I didn't live back then, and unfortunately, there's nobody alive from that time that I could interview. So it's a little bit harder to tell, than like the 70s, when clearly like the Duchess and the Sahara were the most popular places and everybody went there. I can't necessarily say that about that time, especially since it was, the 20s and 30s were a little bit more open than the next few decades, but it still wasn't something people, bragged about or advertised about. Like, this is a gay space. Come here. We want you here.
Absolutely.
It's very much underground.
That has been one of the biggest challenges of this project for me. You're on the ground in New York and have the ability to physically visit the spaces where these places were.
Yes.
I'm doing my research from Florida, uh, and it is not convenient, especially during the past year when you couldn't go anywhere,
Mhm.
to travel and do that. Um, and I found that with gay bars in general, it was difficult to find information prior to probably the mid '60s,
Mhm.
um, because everything was underground in one way or
Mhm.
another. There weren't big national publications that they advertised in. There weren't social media type um, platforms where you could put pictures. People didn't carry cameras around and photograph each other in a bar that was, kind of taboo. Um,
Mhm.
and the whatever ephemera or souvenirs or anything that was saved from those days was probably destroyed by the family when that person died, because who would want to keep, you know, Aunt Gladys's lesbian memorabilia for the next three generations? It just, so there are a lot of reasons why we lost all that information.
Yes.
Um, Now, after the 20s, it seems like the scene kind of diminished for women in Greenwich Village and kind of shifted to Harlem. Is that what I'm, or
I wouldn't say it diminished. I think they're sort of concurrent stories, and they're slightly different types of spaces. The Harlem Renaissance had much more of a performance vibe. There were some spaces that were just bars, but mostly it was, clubs and, places where they played jazz or had drag performances. And so it was sort of a different type of space.
a more of a cabaret type environment?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah, I don't think necessarily in the 100 years of this history that Greenwich Village has ever really diminished in its gayness. I mean, except for if you count like the people who actually live there, and in which case that happened in the 80s with gentrification. And now, like only the very, very rich white male gays live there. But in terms of, nightlife spaces, it's stayed pretty strong throughout the century. But also throughout that time, different other neighborhoods in New York have sort of come and gone uh, for gay centers, and yeah, so the Harlem Renaissance was one of those times when there were a concentration of gay, or at least gay friendly nightlife spaces. And there does seem to be a tapering off of that um, after like the 40s, 50s. And again, I need to research this history specifically more. I think there's a ton more about Harlem that I do not know. And part of that is also the lack of oral histories that I could get from that time so far back. Um, so I'm still putting that chapter together, but yeah, it's not necessarily that the scene shifted up there. It was sort of a different scene, and of course, it was mostly Black people, people of color, and Black lesbian spaces, which is a rarity throughout the century. So the fact that there were concentration of them in that time period was really special.
now that same concept of kind of women's cabaret establishments seems to have poured over into the downtown area
Mm-hmm.
a little bit later, after Harlem had established some of their kind of jazz club, cabaret bars, whatever. You started to see that in downtown, and you identify what might have been the first blatantly lesbian club in New York City as showing up in that time frame downtown. That was the Howdy Club. What can you tell us about the Howdy Club?
Well, again, the history is spotty because it's pretty far back, but it is discussed explicitly almost everywhere that I find mention of it as a lesbian bar, as opposed to some other spaces in this time period and that neighborhood, like the Club 82 and Club 181, which were more just sort of general cabaret drag clubs. This one is identified by many of my sources as a lesbian bar. I have, again, few images. There's one site that has sort of collected a bunch of ephemera that was helpful for images, but I couldn't find the owner of the site to ask the person where they got the images or any more stories. So again, it's a work in progress trying to dig through that history. But one of the most iconic images that everyone uses when they talk about, not everyone, but the few people that I know that talk about lesbian bars in New York City refer to the howdy. It's either the waitresses or the football team, because they have each letter of spelling out howdy on their sweaters.
Yes.
And
I've seen that.
Yes, so it's an iconic photo and is clearly just dripping with lesbianism. So, I mean, if that wasn't an advertisement for a lesbian bar, I don't know what was. So.
And it looks like to me, from what I've seen those pictures as well.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like, and it kind of fits with the era anyway, but it seems like it was a little bit of a dressier place. And by dressier by today's standards, where people wouldn't go in there just looking rumpled and whatever. It looks like they were wearing either nice slacks or a jacket or, a nice sweater or something like that, and presenting themselves a little bit more properly, which is not necessarily an image that you have of what a lesbian bar would be today. Today you have an entirely different picture. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of the people that I've spoken to, they have this preconceived notion that lesbians always, since day one, have run around in faded jeans, Birkenstocks, and oversized T-shirts or something. And the reason I bring that out is because that whole era, everything really from the beginning of the 20th century to the mid 20th century, most of the clubs, other than a few scattered men's bars, were a little bit more proper. You went dressed up. You went, in a dress if you were so inclined, or a nice pair of slacks or a jacket, a little bit more proper attire. It was a completely different environment than what we see now in the bar scene, for the most part.
I would disagree with that statement, but okay.
How
I mean,
so?
you can see I like dressing up. I'm
Well,
a fan of
yes.
myself,
But
but
when you go
I
out
mean,
to a club, you
I
see people in all states of dress, I'm sure.
yeah, I mean, I think that that's its own little mini paper in itself, like the lesbian attire through the ages. I mean, certainly in the 20s, it was the bohemian look, and everybody was androgynous and had their hair cut
Right.
short. I mean, that's a gross oversimplification, but yeah, I would say that a lot of those clubs in the sort of 30s through the 50s that were cabarets were very classy, and you came dressed up, and you either came to be seen as the homosexual or to see the homosexuals. As part of it was like the crowd was on display for the sort of straight tourists who were coming and watching the show, and the other people in the club. So I've definitely heard stories about that in that era. And then, as you get to sort of the 50s, I guess maybe that gets a little grungier. We're not quite there yet, but that's like where the idea of the butch and femme became dominant in terms of, clothing. And it was, most of the lesbian bars at that time were from a working class crowd, and they would dress up, but it wasn't like for a show, because there were no shows in those bars. They were really like low budget, mafia run, horrible, dungy places, from what I understand. And then I think the 70s is where you get the Birkenstocks. That's where for some reason that has stayed as the stereotype, but it's like a few decades past, if you ask me. But
Yeah.
that's where they sort of were like, oh, we don't want to do the butch femme thing anymore. We're lesbians. We're not trying to be men and women. We're trying to, be androgynous in the middle. And there was sort of an image of the lesbian that, you wanted to project. Again, there are exceptions to that. I would say like the Sahara in the 70s, people really dressed up to go there because it was classier than the rest of the bars. And I would say in the 90s, coming closer to today, it became more about sex appeal, and the butch femme thing came back, but in like a, BDSM kind of way, or like, there was sort of an explosion of the expression that you could have. And I would say that has only continued to proliferate, and especially in terms of like gender presentation, and people who don't even identify as women but identify as lesbian and come to those spaces and are not presenting as a butch or a femme or whatever, but it's like a whole new slew of possible expressions. And I wouldn't say that means that they're casual. It depends on the night and the bar and the occasion, but no, it's definitely one of my favorite topics, is the way people presented themselves in these spaces, because it's a huge part of what made them interesting.
Now, you touched on this a little bit. After you had this evolution of the cabaret type venues from probably the 1915 to 1950 or so, you started to see, as you said, the division of the lesbian community as butch or femme, almost in some cases, from what I understand, by force. It was almost like I've heard other women tell me that their recollections of these experiences is some of the bars you went into, they almost basically made you declare at the door, I'm femme or I'm butch, and you had to go to your respective corner and then wait for whatever is going to happen after that, whoever, however your interactions were going to occur. So when that all started around the same time as the mafia started taking hold on not only the female spaces, but the male spaces. Almost every gay bar, and I use the word gay to encompass the whole community at that time, because when I came out in the 70s, gay meant lesbian, gay meant, drag queen, gay meant whatever. But the whole gay bar scene seemed to be controlled by alleged mafia ties in quite a number of cities, whether it was LA, New York, Atlanta, wherever it was. Did you uncover in the course of your research any kind of explanation for why that happened, or do you have any hypotheses?
I have a couple hypotheses. I haven't really tested them with many other historians yet, but I have seen it written about in a few different places. One of them is about their taking over of the jazz scene, and they were making all this money in Prohibition, and when Prohibition ended, they needed a new market, and one of the markets was jazz clubs, because they were still seen as sort of seedy, and also they often had mixed, racially mixed people on stage and in the audience, and
Right.
that was not okay at that time. And the other sort of avenue for the mafia, at least in New York, was the LGBTQ scene, the gay bars. And again, you know, being gay was basically a crime at that time, whether it was the way you dressed or the actual acts that you were performing. And, you know, in the McCarthy era, this started to really, they started to crack down on these spaces in a way that hadn't really happened in the beginning part of the century. And, you know, going back to the thing you were saying about the having to be butch or femme. So part of what I have heard from interviews that I've done and the other sources that I have in my research is that it was also about safety. Because if somebody came in and they didn't look like they belonged, they could have been an undercover cop.
Right.
And one of the ways of like seeing if somebody like was in the crowd or not was if they knew how to present themselves, you know, in this space. So if they were dressed to sort of in the middle, kai kai, as they used to call it, I believe that's how it's pronounced, was like not a butch or a femme, you were a kai kai. And that was seen as suspicious because maybe you were somebody who didn't actually belong there. You were an undercover cop trying to trick people into getting arrested, and, you know, revealing your true lesbian identity and then, you know, putting yourself at risk of arrest. So yeah, I guess that could be perceived as, you know, being forced into something. I've also heard from a lot of women in that time that many people enjoyed that dynamic. You know, it wasn't all bad the way that it was sort of seen in the 70s of like, oh, this is terrible. They're trying to be men and women and it's just a reflection of straight society. I think that it wasn't always that simple. And
so it was sort of certainly a soft core version of role playing. It gave them a little bit of an identity to embrace and interact on that level. They knew what role they were supposed to play or how they were supposed to interact. Is that what you're suggesting, or?
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think that it was so oppressive for everybody who was in that crowd. I think, you know, I've heard varied stories about those spaces, and, you know, I think a lot of people look back on the spaces where they first came out, or, you know, like with a little bit of nostalgia. So even if the space wasn't perfect, and clearly the mafia spaces were not, they were, as I said, grungy, and the drinks were overpriced, and there was no entertainment. You know, it was just a dance floor and a bar. But for many, the sort of excitement of having your own space that was just for lesbians and was underground, and, you know, nobody really knew about it, was important and fun. Like, you know, it wasn't always horrible.
You didn't care who owned it as long as you were welcome there.
Yeah, and also, you know, to talk about that a little bit, you know, not everybody was welcome there. So I'm very clear about that in my thesis and my research, that, you know, going back to those Harlem spaces that were integrated or even majority Black, these spaces were very explicitly white and had a lot of racial discrimination. Audre Lorde talks a lot about this in her biographies, and how she's like one of the few Black women who frequents these spaces, and how she just was discriminated by everybody, the mafia, the other, you know, bar goers. So welcome for some people and maybe not so welcome for other people, but important to this history nonetheless.
And that seemed to be a common thread in the male bars as well for quite a while, all across the country, where until we got into probably the 90s, it was not uncommon to walk into a bar, and whether it was intentionally set up this way or not, but I know from my own experience, many of the bars that I went into, the gay bars that I went into, were predominantly white male. And it didn't have a sign outside that said Black's not welcome. It just kind of evolved that way probably as a result of the discrimination from earlier decades and habitual separation of the races with different neighborhoods. You know, a lot of people would go to the bars closer to their neighborhood, and if you happen to be white and that's the only people that lived in that general area, naturally, I guess you would have more white people in the bar.
I don't think it was natural. It was explicit, at least from the history that I know about in New York. It was explicitly racist. It was, and so was the community for many years. And I think we still struggle with this.
There are cases I ran across in Texas and in Los Angeles where the bars were so explicitly racist that if a person of color attempted to enter the bar, they would require 3 government issued photo IDs to prove their identity. But a white person could very often walk in without showing any ID. And I don't know about you, but I don't have 3 government issued photo IDs in my pocket.
Yeah.
So
I'm looking for which bar it was that Audre Lorde talks about that exact thing happening to her. I believe it was the Pony Stable Inn, but it was one of those, mafia run bars in the 50s and 60s. Might have been the Bagatelle.
I think it might have been the Pony Stable. I think I remember you saying that in the video.
Yeah.
And the Pony Stable was a reincarnation of the Mad Hatter, the same space, basically, same building of the Mad Hatter, correct?
It's the same location. I wouldn't say that it's a different iteration because it was so many decades later. Like there is a few bars that are clearly, a sort of continuation of a lesbian space from an earlier time.
Where they can constantly change owners and names over the decades.
Right, but there's sort of a through line, it's a continuous lesbian space, and this one has a sort of gap in the middle, but it is interesting that, the same spaces keep coming up, and to me it just proves the point that space matters and place matters. And even if these spaces aren't, gorgeous architectural masterpieces, at least the history of these places needs to be preserved because that actual location is just dripping with history.
Yeah, I've seen that in numerous cities. And part of the explanation I've gotten for it is that, and New York is certainly an example of this, most of these bars were not owned by the people who operated the bar. The building was owned by somebody else, and they were just a tenant in a lot of cases. I mean, historically in New York, that seems to be the way it is anyway. But it seems that one explanation is that particular landlord has already expressed a willingness to have a gay or lesbian facility in their building and has done it for 10 or 20 or 30 years. So it's an easy in instead of having to convince the new owner or a different owner why they should be able to open up there and possibly deal with any kind of prejudices or, backlash that the other landlord might have. Have you found that frequently in New York, that the same address has been a series of gay or lesbian spaces?
Yes, I have definitely seen that. I have also seen the opposite, or I guess maybe proving this, however you want to look at it, but the landlord has often been the reason why a lesbian bar has closed, whether that's because it's now a new owner and they don't want that anymore, or whether they're trying to demolish the building and build something new, as so often happens in New York, or whether they just change their mind and decide this is a liability and want to get rid of it. I think it's not always true that a place sort of continues because the landlord is nice, but that might be one of the reasons why a certain location is able to continue longer than another. I would say for one of the current lesbian bars that still exists, Lisa Conestrossi has talked about Henrietta Hudson, and that's one of the reasons why she's been able to stay there for so long. That bar has been there for 30 years now, and she keeps getting long-term leases from the owner that has allowed her to stay where other places have just been priced out like crazy. So,
right. Now, when we started talking about the bar scene in the lesbian bar scene in New York City, we started off with a group of like tea rooms and meeting places that not uncommonly seem to have sort of an intellectual bent to them, or a political bent, where people would go there and discuss political issues and things of that. Then we started to move into a situation where you had more entertainment, like the cabaret situation. And then now you're into the 50s and 60s, where you have this kind of butch femme dichotomy, all of which occurred before the real onset of the feminist movement. Once we hit the 70s, and you started to see a little bit more gay activism, a little bit more feminism, did we see a change in the nature of the bars for women in New York City?
Yes, definitely. So first of all, they just became more pleasant spaces, according to my sources. They were, they offered different kinds of things, not just a dance floor and a bar, but maybe some entertainment or a pool table or live music. That it became sort of more lively environment. And also they had to start competing with those activist groups that you mentioned, who started having their own parties and, sort of nightlife spaces. So they really had to sort of step up their game if they wanted to stay open. And many of them started to be owned, or at least operated, by lesbians. So it seems like the mafia hold sort of lingered into the sort of gay rights era. But at least the spaces that were owned by the mafia were now fronted by a lesbian person who ran the show and, made it
Figurehead.
Welcoming and,
lesbian figurehead.
Right, exactly. And then there were some exceptions where the women actually did own the bar. For example, the Sahara was one of the earliest, if not the earliest, lesbian-owned lesbian bar. And it was owned by a collective of women, a group of women. And it was very explicit about its pro-lesbian stance, its activism. They had politicians come speak, and they saw themselves as a sort of spokesplace for the lesbian community in a way that no space would dare to have done before that. So yes, definitely the space has changed, and
now
by all accounts, improved.
The Sahara opened shortly after Stonewall, is that correct?
Yes, let me find the date for you. So, one second. Sahara opened in 1976.
Oh, so it's 6-7 years later.
Yes. Yeah, and there were a few of those lesbian-run bars before then, but this seems to be the first one where they actually owned the business together.
Now, you mentioned in the video narration that Greenwich Village, by that time, after Stonewall, was kind of accepting of a moderate degree of gay public affection, male public affection, holding hands or being flagrantly gay walking down the street, but not so much for women.
Yes.
which kind of
Yes,
surprises
definitely.
me because I've always thought that lesbians in public face less discrimination. I mean, in my childhood, it wouldn't be really surprising to see two women kiss each other. I mean,
Mhm.
not passionately, but to just kiss each other or hug each other. But two men doing that was a little bit not so much accepted. But you're saying in Greenwich Village, it was exactly the opposite, that the gay men could walk down the street hand in hand and be okay, but the women were not really accepted on that level at that point.
I don't think it's about acceptance. I think it's about safety. I mean, gay men have always had public encounters in a way that gay women have not. I mean, there's not like cruising parks for gay women, for example,
Would they have been
partly because
successful?
well, partly because there is a real danger for women in a patriarchal society in our daily existence. And if you're a gay woman, the danger is doubled. So I think it comes from a very real fear of violence. And, you know, there's definitely many stories of, you know, hate crimes against men in that era, but somehow the men felt safer, at least in certain places in New York. And at least according to many of my sources, the women still only felt safe or safer inside the actual bar. And I would say that that's in many ways still the truth. I mean, you know, there's some sort of spilling out into the street or, you know, more public events, but, you know, we're always just going to be more at risk than men who are at least have some perception of being able to defend themselves, even if that's not actually the case. So,
I had never thought about it on that level. I just always assumed that it was just that gay men typically were more obviously sexually motivated and women were not so much, that women were more intellectual or emotional connections. They wanted to meet somebody who was a soulmate. And most guys that I knew, especially going back into the 70s and 80s, they didn't care if they liked you or not. If they thought you were cute and they wanted to have sex with you, then that was going to happen. Um, and so I always assumed that's why there were no lesbian cruising spots. It wasn't about safety. It's about that lesbians didn't want to just stroll past a line of bachelorettes and pick one out to go home with for the night. I don't know.
I mean, I think there's some truth to that stereotype for sure, but I would say that a lot of those explicitly sex positive spaces in the 90s would start to at least prove that point wrong. And, you know, the idea of sort of hooking up and whatever is definitely part of lesbian nightlife culture. Even as far back as the 50s, I hear stories about, you know, meeting someone for the night and then not,
Right.
you know, talking to them again. You know, I don't think it's only because we mate for life like penguins. I don't know. You know, it's not that simple. But yeah, I think the quotes that I have in the thesis are more about safety than about, you know, visibility or acceptance. So
Right.
yeah.
Now you started to kind of touch on the 90s scene when you started having some of these roaming parties and themed events that were recurring.
Mm-hmm.
And I was interviewing um, the communications director for the National LGBTQ Task Force the other day.
Mm-hmm.
And she's from New York as well, and a lesbian. And she mentioned a club to me that I thought I never would have expected a women's club to have that name. Men's clubs in the gay world have had some of the most vulgar, sexually blatant names that I've ever seen in my life. And it seemed to be like a badge of honor, you know. And she said one of her favorite clubs in the 90s in New York City was called the Clit Club.
Yes. One of my favorite names for sure.
Um, Now, the Clit Club was not actually a physical space, was it?
There was one location that it recurred for a number of years, but to my definition of a space that all nights of the week cater
Right,
to lesbians, and their main thing is serving alcohol, that doesn't really fit the definition, because the party was only on certain nights of the week. So it wasn't a full-time lesbian bar. There were other gay parties that happened in that space. And the party itself moved to different locations a few times.
right,
So according to my definition, it's not a lesbian bar, but I think it served that function for that generation,
right,
definitely, in the way that there's still a number of sort of roaming parties that exist today that follow that model of, they're usually in the same place, but it's only on Fridays, or
right,
it's like every month and they change different locations, or something like that. And the community kind of sees them in a similar way of like, oh yeah, that's the place we're going to go out on Friday. But, the rest of the nights of the week, if you're looking for a lesbian space,
that's not it.
that location is not going to be it. Yeah, it's going to be a
Right.
straight bar or a gay male bar or something else. So I would argue it's a different typology and sort of has a different
I agree.
parallel history. But
But it did make somewhat of an impact in the fact that she
huge
remembered
impact.
that from 30 years ago
For
as being
sure.
a favorite, hangout. Um, 30 years later, she's still talking about it. So
Yes.
obviously it was significant. And I guess also the name itself is kind of an indication that, at least in that particular environment, the women had embraced the whole sexual revolution of the 70s and 80s that had kind of opened everything up, and you started to see more of this whole free love concept and all of that. They were finally owning it in a lesbian space, which is a little bit different than a name like Cubbyhole, which kind of suggests that you're hiding somewhere. It's like diametrically opposed to that concept, saying here, not only are we lesbian, but we're going to throw our genitalia in your face with the name and the imagery that we use in our ads. Um, so it was kind of a way of reclaiming your space um, on a different level. But so there were quite a number of different roaming parties and clubs for women in Manhattan throughout the 90s and the 2000s. But over the last 20 years, there has been a steep decline in the number of lesbian spaces, not only in New York, but everywhere in the country
And the world, by the
and the
way.
world. Um, there's a project I'm sure you're familiar with called the Lesbian Bar Project
Yes.
that is partially underwritten by Jägermeister.
Hmm.
I'm not sure why. Do lesbians drink more Jägermeister, or are they trying to get you to drink more Jägermeister?
I'm assuming that was the sponsorship they were able to get, but I am not, familiar enough with the project to know why that particular liquor was the one that sponsored us. But
But they claim that there's, depending on which list you look at, there are only around 17 or 18 lesbian bars in the entire US that still exist, and three of them happen to be right at your back door.
yes,
So you could travel 500 miles without finding another lesbian bar, but if you stay at home, you have three choices.
yes.
Uh, One of them you already mentioned, Henrietta Hudson.
Hmm.
One of them I just mentioned, the Cubbyhole.
Hmm.
And the third one is called Ginger's Bar.
Yes.
Have you been to those bars?
I've been to all three, and they've all been struggling through the pandemic, as all businesses, small businesses have. Two of them have reopened, Henrietta's and Cubbyhole, and Ginger's has been dormant still, but we'll see if they resurface. And they've all been around for decades, which if you look at this history is very impressive. There are very few bars that have lasted more than a few years, honestly. I'm sure it's the same for gay bars. Part of it is just the business of, like running a business in a big city is always a risk. And if your business caters to a small portion of the population, and in the case of the lesbian bar, if that small portion of the population makes half as much money because both of the people make less money in the couple, you're even more out of luck in terms of your funding model. And there's been so many articles about the disappearance of lesbian bars and why it's happening and what's the cause and whatever. Is it, lesbians, as you were saying, like to couple up and they don't want to go out and whatever, find new people? Or is it that Tinder has ruined everything and, we can meet everybody online, so why do we need a physical space? In my thesis, I argue that it's mostly to do with gentrification and with crazy rent prices. This is certainly true of New York, true of San Francisco, other places that just have rapidly gentrified over the past 20 or so years, as you said. And keeping a business open, if you don't have that long-term lease like Lisa Canestrasi has, it's almost impossible to break even, let alone make a profit. So that is the story that I've heard from all the bar owners that I interviewed. And I would argue that that is the main killer of the lesbian bar. Other people have different opinions, but that is mine. So
I've seen that in other cities before, and not just as a result of the pandemic or anything recent, but over a period of time. One thing that I don't know if you came across this in your research or not, but as I said, I first started going to gay bars in the late 70s. And at that time, in the 70s and 80s, it was not uncommon for a gay male to be at a gay bar 5 nights a week. Mm-hmm. I mean, Tuesday, Thursday, didn't matter. You went out, stayed out, drank until midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, whenever you had to go home. Was that generally true in the women's scene, or are women just less inclined to go to bars that frequently? I mean, do you need to have 10 times as many lesbians to keep the bar busy 7 nights a week?
I don't know that I have enough evidence here to make broad generalizations. I will say that, many of these bars have regulars that come almost every night. And I mean, we both know that alcoholism and drug abuse is a bigger problem in the LGBTQ community than, in the mainstream straight community for many, many reasons. But I don't necessarily think that that people don't go out that the lesbians don't go out every night. I think it has more to do with the opportunities, the expendable income, many reasons. That might be one of them, but I think it's not just that, for sure. It's a whole combination of issues.
Now, there was another lesbian bar that probably the most recent lesbian bar to close in New York City closed less than 2 years ago, and that was the Boom Boom Bar. Did you ever go there?
Unfortunately, I did not. I was trying to go and then they closed. And I actually had heard that even in the year before they closed, they were sort of spotty about being open. Sometimes people would, make the trek all the way out there in the middle of Queens and it would not be open that night for some reason. So I think they were struggling a bit before they actually closed, and right in the middle of my thesis work. But
how dare they?
I know. And I think this goes to part of what I was just talking about, where it has more to do with the neighborhood than, the bar's business model, or, how they operate.
Right.
Woodside, where that bar was a lesbian community when the bar opened, and particularly Latina lesbian community. And by the time the bar closed, the neighborhood was changing, and that sort of core base of customers didn't live there anymore. And it's not like Greenwich Village, where it's sort of centrally located with all the trains. And, even if you live way out in Bushwick, you can make the trek down to Greenwich Village.
Right. Or you may already work in that area.
Sure,
that's
right.
Another thing too. Manhattan, no matter how many people live in Manhattan, there's 2 or 3 times that many people that are there every day for work or business. And that concludes another segment of the Gay Barchives podcast. You can find more podcasts at gaybarchives.com/podcast. We also have more information about this podcast and links to the other podcasts we have completed. We hope you enjoy your trip down memory lane.